More tales told by a Dubliner, by Turlough Conmee. Story number 9. The Grey Legion. I remember in the 1980s in Canada, there was a definite political lurch to the right. It happened in Ontario with what was called the Common Sense Revolution. This was a new policy direction for government, which meant downsizing the civil service, making government cost less, reducing taxes, and getting the private sector to provide public services. In the provincial civil service, where I worked by this time, there was daily alarm about how this or that service had been privatised. This meant one of two things. Either an outside bona fide company was contracted to do what a particular civil service department had been doing, or the soon-to-be jobless civil servants formed a company of their own to do the work outside the ministry. Added to this was a grey legion of individuals who may or may not have been civil servants, but were now doing government work on a project basis. The magic phrase in all of this was, at arm's length. The outside companies and individuals were to be at arm's length from the government, so that there was no employer-employee relationship. That was the theory of it anyway, and the ministries may or may not have saved money as a result. It was hard to tell. One of the things that made the whole situation unclear was the number of former civil servants rehired as individual contractors. These were known as shadow FTEs. A full-time equivalent, or FTE, was personnel jargon for a civil service position. These individuals were in the shadows now. They were not on the books, but it was hard to see the difference between the work they did at home alone and the 9-to-5 job of an employee. So a ministry would have so many FTEs budgeted for, but then it was whispered, the work still has to get done. Beyond the FTEs, who worked in the busy, brightly lit offices, there might be an army of shadow FTEs that ministries hardly knew or hardly admitted were there. At the same time, the computer revolution was happening. Small computers, PCs, appeared on desks, and soon they were linked in communication networks. This had an effect on shadow FTEs. They were working off-site, which usually meant at home. Yet they had to furtively slip into their ministries quite often to meet their handlers and even sit in on meetings. I was one of those individuals, and others of the same shadowy tribe who were in the know told me, they like to see your smiling face. This I found to be true. If you didn't go into the office for a few days, there would be anxious calls from the handlers, just wanting to touch base, as they put it. Then it started to be noticed that computers were slowly but surely eroding that personal interaction. The shadow FTEs had computers now too, and they could communicate with their ministry by means of a newfangled thing called email. You wrote what used to be called a covering memo, attached your work file, you pressed send, and the piece of work was on its way to your handlers. There were also ministry networks you could dial into. That meant you could download files to work on and upload them again when you were finished. Now, man is a social animal, and old habits die hard. But the phone rang at home less and less often as the years went by, and there wasn't the same expectation about seeing your smiling face. You did go into the office every so often, just to show the flag. The handlers tried to include you, make you feel like you belonged to the team. You lunched with them. You even got invited to staff parties. As further time went by, and I worked in this mode for many years as a way to make a living, both in the public and private sectors, there was a definite change. The handlers didn't call you into meetings. They informed you of the decisions made in your absence, if you were lucky. There were no more invitations to lunch or even coffee. If ever you did go into the office now, the newer people didn't even know who you were. When you introduced yourself, the name rang a bell with them, or maybe not. You realised that the handlers and the powers that be above them had no interest in you as a person. The system of remote work on contract that had established itself in the working world by now was here to stay, and people knew how it worked, the unspoken as well as the explicit rules. There were no real issues to hammer out. You did it their way, or they could always get somebody else. The handlers and the powers that be relished not having to deal with you. Working relationships, all that human stuff, just take up time and energy that could be put into being more productive and efficient. You had become just a source of work done, of projects completed. As long as the work kept coming, the money kept flowing, and that was all you could expect. Now, you might start to feel a bit lonely about this, a bit neglected maybe. But I, for one, came to realise that the system had its advantages. It was a case of procula Jove, far from Jove, far from his thunderbolt. You didn't get into fights. You didn't become intensely involved with people. You maybe dealt with them for a year or two, then you heard they'd left and moved on. You had a feeling of outliving everybody if you worked for an outfit for long enough. And here was the real payoff. You were getting older and presumably less with it, less clued in, less cool a guy all the time, damn it. But nobody noticed. They imagined you, you hoped, as dynamic and 40-ish. Whereas, as the ma used to say to me, you'll never see it again, only on a hall door. Now, your date of birth would be recorded somewhere in personnel, but who would bother to look? So you did your best to keep up the illusion. You studiously avoided saying things like, when I was a young fella, or I remember the days before computers. No, you played along as an eternal youth, puer aeternus. Just once in a while the thought might strike you. How long can this go on? How long can you fly under the radar undetected before some bored personnel officer with nothing to do sifts through the old files and pauses over one and mutters, "Good God, this guy is 85 years old. He's got to go." I'm thinking of all this because of the case of Noel Hughes, which made such a sensation in the Dublin papers recently. I must have met Noel in the 1980s in Toronto. He was an Irish lad, a Dubliner like myself, and he was working for a ministry in a department that got privatised at around the same time as I joined the shadow FTE circuit. We used to see each other at the occasional meeting or seminar. He decided to go back to Ireland around the same time as I did, and we met for lunch one last time at a Chinese restaurant downtown, promising to keep in touch back in the old country. In fact, we met a few times back in Dublin, but we were both preoccupied with finding work, me in editing or technical writing, him in his field of computer systems. As a result, we drifted apart. But I always kept his address. I just never knew for sure when he was in Dublin, and I was often out of town myself. When I met mutual acquaintances, I would always ask, "Any news of Noel?" And people who were out and about in the business world more than I was would often have something to report. It seems Noel owed whatever prosperity he enjoyed in later life to Man. I didn't know what Man was, but I was told that it was a system for running common business functions, a kind of software that helped you keep track of inventory, accounts and the like. The heyday of Man was now over, but the company Noel had worked for as a senior systems analyst in their Dublin office, Nevada Electronics, was so invested in Man to track their spare parts and components and what have you, they were like a junkie that couldn't kick his drug habit for love or money. Noel had gone out on early retirement, which didn't surprise me. "Would you want to be a systems analyst if you could help it?" he'd asked me once in the early days of our association. But as I said, Nevada was hooked on Man, and Noel was the main dealer in the stuff they craved. So they asked him to work from home, just maintaining this legacy system, as they called it, until a new system could be found and all the precious data migrated to it. He was able to name his price, so he said yes, and he worked from home part-time after that. He knew Man like the back of his hand. He also understood how to implement the patches that were issued from time to time for all the legacy customers. Eventually the patches stopped coming, but Noel knew enough by this stage to write his own patches. This work was all done at arm's length, of course. All Nevada really knew was that Noel lived somewhere in Dublin. Emails were exchanged, uploads and downloads were made to the Nevada server by VPN client. The invoices came in at the end of the month, and a payment was credited to his account. It went like clockwork. And as the Yanks say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Noel was an unknown quantity to the newer staff at Nevada because he never came in. Why would he? He was Mr. Man. Nobody else knew anything about it. To them, it was a black box, and he ran it. After a while, no one knew anymore what Noel looked like. No one knew what age he was, though I suppose there were some yellow and paper forms with his date of birth on them in some old filing cabinet long since moved to storage. Probably Noel liked it that way, for the same reason as I did. People could think of you as 40ish, dynamic and entrepreneurial, whereas you were really one of the dinosaurs. I was away working in Switzerland for several years, but one time I was back in Dublin. It must have been 2010. I had a meeting over at Grand Canal Dock, and I recalled that the bald Noel lived somewhere in the neighbourhood, in a little old workman's cottage down a lane just a stone's throw from the canal. I tried to phone him in advance, of course, but got no answer. So I decided just to pop around and see if he was home after me meeting. The laneway where he lived wasn't too hard to find. It was a row of rather run-down houses and tradesmen's workshops and garages. Still, I was taken aback when I found Noel's address. It was a little detached cottage, but the windows were boarded up. I knocked at the door. But of course it was no use. There was no answer. The place looked abandoned. I didn't know what to think. Where was Noel? Where could Mr. Man be holed up now? He had to be somewhere. I stood back and looked at the bleak little house from the laneway. Then a man emerged from the garage next door. He was in overalls and looked like he worked in there. I asked him about the fellow who lived in the cottage, but he just shook his head. "Never seen anybody go in there or come out of it," he said. "It's been empty for as long as I can remember." Afterwards, I saw an older woman come out the door of her house and stand for a while in the afternoon sun. She looked like she might know the neighbourhood, I thought. She might be a long-time resident. So I approached her. "I'm looking for an old friend, Noel Hughes. That's supposed to be his house." I pointed to the cottage. "But no one seems to be living there now." "Aye," she said. "I remember that man Noel Hughes. He lived there on his own. He'd been over in America, hadn't he?" "Canada, right. And he came home and bought that little house maybe 7 years ago. Used to see him going in and out. Then he went away again. We all thought he'd upped and left and gone back to Canada." "Back to Canada?" I said in puzzlement. "I thought he was home for good." "Well, be that as it may," said the woman, "there hasn't been anybody living there for years. So the corpo men came around a couple of years ago and boarded the place up to keep out vandals and that sort of thing." I went away shaking me head. I made no further attempt to establish contact with Noel, as he seemed to have disappeared and covered his tracks. Years went by. The next thing I heard was what was in all the papers last year. The corporation had gone to the cottage and beat down the door, intending to serve a compulsory purchase order so they could demolish this supposedly abandoned house. When they went inside, though, they found the place furnished in the usual way, suggesting that it was still lived in, though it was all very dusty. In the bedroom, lying on the bed, didn't they find a corpse? "Skeletal remains," was what the report said. At this stage, they turned the case over to the guards, and the state pathologist was called in to do an autopsy, or at least identify these remains. They did it through dental records at one of the local dentists. Noel had been to him a few times, it seemed, and it was Noel all right. Obviously the body had been lying there for a very long time. The guards found a package of butter in the fridge with an expiry date in 2001. So he'd been dead for 20 years. Everybody had thought he was somewhere else, and there he was in his own home, dead. There was a great deal of comment in the papers about how awful this was. A man being dead for 20 years and no one knew or cared. Well, they did care, because it emerged that a few relatives of his had tried to contact him, but they all came up against a stone wall, or in this case, a boarded up house. It was just a terrible thing that someone could fall through the cracks like that. What did it say about our society? The excuse the neighbours had was that Noel had been an emigrant. He had come from Canada, and when he didn't show his face anymore, they assumed he must have gone back to Canada again. Once the identification had been made to the satisfaction of officialdom, a hasty funeral was arranged for Noel. I went. It was the least I could do. He was buried in a family plot in Mount Jerome. Afterwards we stood outside the gates. There weren't many people apart from a few officials. I didn't know any of Noel's friends in Dublin, and he didn't seem to have any family living. One face I did recognise in the small crowd was Marcus O'Brien. He was the IT manager at Nevada Electronics. He was obviously here to show his respects on behalf of the company. He must have been Noel's handler, the last in a long line of handlers. But when had that been? We talked a bit about Noel and how terrible it was, him dying alone in the house and no one knew, or thought to look. It had clearly been a case of everybody thought somebody should do something, so in the end nobody did anything. But listen, Marcus said to me confidentially, it's even worse than that. We still had Noel on the books. That's why I'm here. What do you mean, still on the books? I asked. Marcus sighed unhappily. "Listen," he said, "would you come and have a jar somewhere, and I'll tell you all about it." We repaired to a local hostelry, and when we sat down with our pints at a table in a quiet corner, I said again, "So what's this about having Noel on the books? Were you paying him money, not knowing he was dead this 20 years? "No," groaned Marcus, "it's even worse than that. He was, well, we thought he was still working for us." "Good God," I said, "were you getting work from him?" Marcus nodded. "I inherited him from the previous IT manager. I never actually saw him. Nobody did. Though everybody who had been there a while seemed to know who he was. But he was working remotely, from home. Jay, how long was that going on for?" "Well, the past 10 years that I've been in the job, and God knows how long before that." "Let me get this straight," I said. "He was working for Nevada for over 25 years, right?" Noel nodded. "And for at least 20 of them years, he was dead." I couldn't help chuckling at the idea. "So how did the whole system work?" "It was all man-man," said Marcus. "The legacy system. People like me only knew the name, but Noel knew all about it. He was Mr. Man-Man. It was frightening how much we depended on him. He dealt with all the new patches as they were issued. He wrote new routines whenever they were needed for new stock. Then he was making patches of his own because there was no more official support. He said once in an email to somebody, 'That system is so old and sly, it can just about patch itself by now.'" Marcus looked at me aghast for a minute. "Maybe that's it. It patched itself. Man-Man started to patch itself. Could that have been it?" He looked at me helplessly. "Get a hold of yourself, man," says I. "Systems don't patch themselves, especially not an old clunker like Man-Man." "I suppose," he said. "So what else?" "Well, tell me how your system operated," I said. "How did you work with him?" "We sent out an email every so often, detailing what the latest problem with Man-Man was. He just had to get into the server using his VPN client and could then tinker around with Man-Man as he pleased. At the end of the month, we got an email from him to say that the problem was fixed or the request filled. Always the same email just about. Attached would be an invoice. It was always the same invoice for the same amount, just the date changed. Then we paid him by our payables deadline. You see, he was officially an independent contractor, at arm's length, you know, but he always got the same amount, like a retainer, if you like. And I don't think he was working for anybody else." "He was loyal," I said, "you see?" "I'll go out with that," Marcus said miserably now. "But," I went on, "I still don't understand how he kept going at all. Didn't they cut off the electricity when the bills weren't paid? No computing, no internet without electricity. And were their unpaid taxes mounting up?" "That's another part of it," Marcus replied. "The guards were over to talk to me the other day because they had looked in his computer. It was powered on, by the way. It was just in sleep mode. They studied the transactions and they were able to explain. The money from us was going into the current account at his bank every month. That was no problem. He maintained a healthy balance. As regards his own monthly payables, he had them set up automatically. His electricity bill was paid that way on a standing order. I don't know about income tax. It may well be that when he came back to Ireland, he never filed an income tax return, because he'd never filed one before he went to work in Canada. He was under the radar." "Indeed he was," says I. "Well, that explains everything, doesn't it?" Everything and nothing, says Marcus. Did the guards ask you about the work he did? I mean, the work he was still doing. Marcus shook his head. I didn't tell them. I was sure they wouldn't believe me. As it is, they'd think he was being paid due to an oversight on our part. You don't hear anything from Noel since then, do you? Not since they found him. Not since they found the body and took away the computer, he added darkly. More to the point, says I, nodding grimly. We felt silent for a while and drank our pints. So what do you do now with Man? I asked finally. The spell is well and truly broken, I suppose. He nodded. We'll have to get in one of those IT consultant firms specialising in legacy systems. They'll have the job of migrating the inventory data to the new system. It should have been done years ago, of course. We put it off because we had Noel. Now, without Noel, we'll have to bite the bullet. It'll take months. It'll cost 100,000 or more. Good old Noel, says I. He was loyal. You have to hand it to him. He kept things going for longer than he should have. Marcus looked pretty glum. I wanted to put the whole thing in context for him. I wanted him to know the reality I knew, being one of the grey legion of shadow employees that government and the corporate world no longer want to know about. Listen, I said, let me tell you about an old book I once read by the philosopher Karl Popper called The Open Society. This was a book that came out in 1950. One passage particularly caught my eye. Popper says that we have a more and more open society in modern times, but it's tending in the direction of an abstract society. That is, he explains, a society where people no longer have face-to-face encounters. You might belong to a union whose leaders or headquarters you never see. You just have a membership card. You might work for a company and never see its managers, or for that matter, your own colleagues, if you or they work remotely. People could drive around alone in cars and never meet one another. With artificial insemination, the species could be perpetuated without human contact. Now, here he was having a bit of a laugh, of course. And then the idea seems to have got too nightmarish for him. For he assures the reader that there could never be a fully abstract society, because man has a need for the company of his fellow humans. He also pointed out that a more abstract society has its advantages as well as its disadvantages. In such a society, you're not restricted to your own family or to the people around you to find friends. Or workmates, I thought. You can pick and choose freely. There's a new individualism. A new freedom. Begod, I muttered to myself after reading this, don't be too sure. Of course, Popper was writing this before the age of computers. Probably he couldn't really envisage a world like ours, where you work with people, often quite closely, but never meet them, never see them. You think you know them, but you don't really. You don't know what they look like, or even how their voices sound. For being at arm's length, and not being one of the team, you don't belong to the inner circle who get to participate in Zoom conferences now. There might not be anyone like you think they are. They could be just avatars of somebody completely different. What you take to be a person could just be the responses of a program that the person turned on to handle routine inquiries and transactions. The person might be retired. They might be really old. They might be dead. Good old Noel, says I. He was one of that army of shadow warriors to which I belong. The shadows of living, breathing people you knew and got along with, or didn't, and who then faded out of the office environment to work God knows where, as long as they were at arm's length. Out of sight, out of mind. But we keep working and doing our bit, you see. We're very loyal in our own way. Or maybe we're still hungry for acknowledgement. For some of us, it gets to be a habit we just can't stop doing. Marcus was silent for a while. He was thinking. The poor bugger, he said finally. Is there anything we can do for him now? Tell you what, says I. We'll have a novena a mass is said for the repose of his soul. Wouldn't that be good? Marcus nodded silently. That way, I added, he'll be at peace wherever he is, without his computer. And you won't be getting any more work downloaded from remote locations. You have been listening to The Grey Legion by Turlough Conmee from More Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.